So, my guest today is not only intelligent, talented, and can think unconventionally, he's a great educator too, but someone who is also kind and humble and can express very complex systems in terms that we can all understand. We're meeting Dr. Dale Bredesen to learn more about his groundbreaking research in dementia. It was a real honor to have Dr. Bredesen on the podcast back in 2021, and now a double honor to have him on for a second time to discuss one of his most recent books, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. And we also want to cover a little bit more of his latest research. Dr. Dale Bredesen is a scientist, a researcher, and an expert in neurodegenerative diseases, particularly Alzheimer's disease. He's published over 200 papers, which many of them you can find in PubMed research. And in 2017, he wrote a groundbreaking book and New York Times bestseller called The End of Alzheimer's. And then several years after that, wrote a follow-up book called The End of Alzheimer's Program. And last year, he wrote The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, How Patients Recovered Life and Hope in Their Own Words. Dr. Bredesen is a professor at UCLA, but he's also taught at UC San Francisco and the University of California, San Diego. He directed the program on aging at the Burnham Institute before going to the Buck Institute for Research on Aging in 1998 as its founding president and CEO. Now, most doctors and experts in this field say that there is no cure for Alzheimer's. But Dr. Bredesen blatantly says that Alzheimer's is absolutely reversible and preventable. He's going totally against the grain with his research, which he's been working on for decades. And he's been consulting patients too, who've been told by their doctors to just go and get their affairs in order before they die because there is nothing they can do to help them. But now Dr. Bredesen is not only giving these people hope, but actually a future that they can look forward to. So now, without further ado, meet Dr. Dale Bredesen. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Sora. Thanks for having me on.
Is there anything, I kind of added some couple of things to your intro. Did I get it right?
Yeah, you got it right. And yes, we are, our research over the years showed something that others are still finding hard to believe. In fact, I just got a nasty tweet from a physician, a well-recognized physician who treats patients with Alzheimer's in the UK and claims that absolutely nothing could be done except give them some drugs that don't work. And how dare I say anything? Well, read our studies, read our published trial. We had a very successful trial, which is freely available online to anyone who wants to look it up. It's in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease from last June. In fact, it's interesting, it has been for the last several months, it's been the number. You look at they have a list of what's most popular articles of the entire year. It's the #1 article people have been interested in. So there's a lot going on, and there's actually a documentary coming out on our work. And they've got I'm not supposed to say who's the narrator, but he's a great guy that you'll recognize. Who has a fabulous singing voice, and he does a great job as the narrator. So I appreciate that he was interested in this enough to do it. And so should be out in the next few months, and goes, talks to some of the patients and talks to, how were they doing before? How are they doing now? So wow. Zora, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
If you read the 7 stories of the people in the First Survivors of Alzheimer's, were you able to get through all of the 7 with no tears?
No, of course not. I was so touched. I think that now that you say that there's a documentary coming out, that's going to be so much more impactful, because reading their stories is truly inspiring, especially if you have somebody going through Alzheimer's, or if you're concerned about this. They explain how they have the progression, the degeneration, and then they come back, and then their lives are changed, and it's so impactful. So I would love to see these people's faces and follow their stories. I think this was a brilliant idea.
Well, you'll see them. So the documentary interviews. Yeah, the documentary interviews some of the people who were in the book, and they talk about their own stories. And I mean, I have to say, it really touched me, because when we got the very first person to reverse her cognitive decline, which was back in 2012, so we have people now over 10 years who have continued their improvement, which is unheard of. She's now, by the way, this patient 0. And she is in the documentary, and she also wrote a wonderful story for the book. These people continue to be improved because you're addressing the things that are actually causing the problem. And she's actually now a brain health coach and doing absolutely great. So very exciting to see this. And when I started getting various emails from these people, I was so touched by some of these. You read the story of the attorney from New York, who, Harvard graduate, brilliant woman, who watched her grandmother die of Alzheimer's, watched her father die of Alzheimer's, and now is having problems herself, and looking at her children, realizing, oh my gosh, are they going to go through the same thing? And then just the way she wrote about her experience and what it meant to her to improve. And she actually went to her father on his deathbed. When he didn't recognize her, he just knew that she was someone he loved. So he would cry when she would come into the room and hold her, but he didn't know her name. And she sat there and said to him, I want you to know I'm going to be all right. And my only regret is that this was not available when you were having problems, because he was then at that point, ready to die. If you can get through all that stuff without it touching you, then you are a cold person, because it's really, really striking. And so I, got so many of these. So I wrote to these 7 people, and I said, your stories are so compelling. Nobody out there realizes that, in fact, you can reverse this problem. You can get improvement. Not 100% of people, but many people. We have over 500 now with good documentation. We've published a number of papers on this as well. So these 7 said, yeah, we'd love to write our stories. And so they all became part of the book.
Yeah, you could see what was one of them, I don't remember her name, but she said she hesitated even in writing it because it would bring back some really horrific memories, and it's devastating. But she, in the end, said, look, this is going to help so many other people by sharing the story. So it's fabulous that they are sharing, because it is unbelievable, especially if you've never heard this before, that you can reverse, or you can have improvement, or just massively slow this down. I think it's, for a lot of people, shocking. When I first heard about you and your book, it was really new to me. And so I'm glad that there is this documented, but the documentary is going to be even more impactful and bring more hope, especially if somebody's told you, the doctor said, look, go home and die. I mean, anyone who says, look, I've recovered, even if it's one person, you're going to go talk to that person and say, what did you do? Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, as you say, when you're not ready to see something, and interestingly, one of the patients who is a doctor herself said people don't believe it because they're not ready to believe it. They're not ready to hear it. But when you actually meet the people and hear their stories, it's just, it really shows you. And then, of course, we have data. We published the trial, as I mentioned, where 84% of the people improved. The other thing to know is that people are going about this backwards. There are 4 stages you go through when you develop Alzheimer's-related dementia. The first stage, you don't have symptoms, but you can already show, often in your 30s, that there are changes in PET scans, for example. The second stage is what's called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. And that actually lasts about 10 years. And the definition of that is that there's something wrong. Often your spouse and sometimes your coworkers will know something's not quite right, but you're still able to score in the normal range on cognitive testing. By definition, that's SCI. Everyone who has SCI reverses in our protocol. We don't have any problem reversing that. So if everybody would just not wait, get on active prevention, which is stage 1, or stage 2 SCI, you're going to do great. Now, the third and fourth stages are where everybody treats it. The third stage is MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And the good news, in our trial, 84% of those people got better. We didn't do it for SCI. We wanted to let people be more the typical way they would be when they present to their neurologists. But even that, which is a relatively late stage, and it's too bad that someone years ago chose the term mild cognitive impairment, because it really should be called relatively late stage Alzheimer's disease. It's like telling someone with cancer, don't worry, you only have mildly metastatic cancer. It's a late stage of the disease. And yet we can still get people to improve in many, not all, but in many cases. Then the fourth and final stage is actually dementia. And by definition, then you've begun to lose the activities of daily living. And as you know, you end up at the end where you can't care for yourself, you really can't do anything. And so, and yet we've seen people, even in the late stages, improve. I had a wonderful email from one of the practitioners we've trained. We trained over 2,000 practitioners in 10 different countries and all over the US. And she told me that one of her patients just came in with a MoCA score of 6 out of 30, which is end stage dementia.
Wow.
The average for all people with Alzheimer's is 16. So a 6 is very, very late. And she improved to 13, which is fantastic. So now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the difference between caring for yourself and not caring for yourself, between interacting with people, being engaged. So just, huge subjective changes and improvements in this particular person. And by the way, the same person who, the doctor herself, is Dr. Sanderson, who's in San Diego, has started the first assisted living facility using our protocol and is having tremendous results with it. She's actually got her own trial, which is now successful, and she's submitted for publication. She talks about in the film that the first patient she ever saw, she didn't believe it. She came to one of my talks. She didn't believe it herself. So she said, okay, let me just see about this. She used it on the first patient. The patient came back better, and the doctor started crying because she said she'd never imagined in her life that she would be treating people and making their cognition better.
I cannot wait to see this documentary. It's truly mind-blowing. I want to ask, so actually you said there were a couple of things that came to my mind. You've had thousands of people go through this protocol that you've created. So about 5,000 is what was in the book. I don't know what it is now.
Yeah, and we have continued people coming through, but we don't have follow-up on all of
them. Yeah, that was the question. So yeah, because in the study that you did, you had 84% recovery. I think there was maybe 29 people or so, or
25 people in that study, yeah. And now we're actually started a larger study at 6 different sites in the US. Now that'll be going on for the next about year and a half. So we'll have a larger randomized controlled trial. But yes, in our proof of concept trial, which was the one that was published, 84% of the people improved.
Incredible. And do you know how many people are going to be in the next randomized controlled trial?
Yeah, it'll be about 75.
Okay. And then this study that is being done in this, the doctor who opened up the center where she's doing her own clinical trial, do we know how many people?
Yeah, hers was also right around 30. And, people have said, well, gee, is 75 enough? Well, here's the thing. Why do most of these drug trials use 1,500 people? It's because to get a statistically significant difference, a difference that you can actually say, oh, yes, this is different. It's such a tiny effect that these drugs have, because you're just hitting one thing. You're not treating what's actually causing it. It's such a tiny effect that you can't measure it as statistically significant unless you have over 1,000 people. In our case, we have a big impact. So even with 25 people, it was statistically significant at less than 0.001. Yeah. So when you have a big, the bigger the effect, the fewer number of people you actually have to show that you're getting a statistically significant effect.
Oh, I'm so glad you explained that, because some people challenge me on that. And now I have a great answer. So the other question that I have is, because as I'm reading through the stories, we see a lot of women, of course, because this is a female-centric disease. And when in hindsight, some of them said, well, I started to have cognitive decline during perimenopause, which is about 5 years before menopause, around their late 40s. And some of them think, well, I have brain fog, that's menopause. And you mentioned in your recode in the protocol that hormone optimization is important. That's part of the protocol. So if a woman is just having a bit of trouble of clarity of mind and memory, how does she know if she's just having cognitive issues because of the loss of hormones, or is it because of early onset dementia?
It's a great question. And you don't know for sure unless you get evaluated by a physician. So we recommend that everyone get evaluated. And so, this is critical. As you say, women in that perimenopausal period, very, very important. As Maria Shriver has said, and others have said, yes, this is a woman-centric disease. It's almost 2-to-1, as you mentioned. So it's something that's so critical. And what we're saying now is this is becoming optional. As hard as it is to believe that, getting Alzheimer's is becoming optional. If everybody would get on active prevention, we recommend, 45 years of age or older, you want to get on active prevention. Check it out. We've produced something called a cognoscopy. Everybody knows when you get to be 50, what do? You get a colonoscopy. And actually, my wife and I, when we turned 50, we're like, okay, we got to get a colonoscopy. How are we going to do this? So we had his and hers on Valentine's Day. We just thought, okay, let's get this over with. Then we'll go out and have a nice dinner together. So just get it done. And the same thing. And I have to say, a cognoscopy is much more pleasant than a colonoscopy. So it's easy to do. It's basically 3 things, and you can even go on like mycognoscopy.com and see how to do it. Number 1, you get some blood tests, and unfortunately, most doctors are not doing these blood tests. So you need to get the critical ones that actually address the things that are giving you risk for cognitive decline. Secondly, you have an online cognitive assessment. It's pretty easy, and it takes about 25 minutes or so, and you can see where you stand because this problems do sneak up on you. And of course, you mentioned the brain fog. So many people, because of COVID-19, are saying, you know what, something is not quite right. And that's the time to get in there and do something about it. At that point, virtually everybody can be addressed very successfully. So why sit there with brain fog and say, maybe I'm going to go downhill and maybe I'm not? The other key point that you brought up is, as you enter the perimenopause period, what happens? Well, you have a period of 7 years when you have what's called an osteoclastic burst. Here's what that means. So your bones have osteoblasts that are laying down the bone and osteoclasts that are picking up the bone. And for most of your life, these things work very nicely together. And so they continually make your bones better and better. It's just like working on your house. You're getting a little demolition here. Now you're putting the next room up. You're doing something here. Now imagine that the people doing the destruction kept doing more than they should, and actually the ones doing the construction never showed up. Your house would now begin to get smaller and smaller. And that's what's happening during this osteoclastic burst. Your osteoclasts taking up the bone are outstripping your osteoblasts. So unfortunately, the drug approach is let's just kill the osteoclasts, but that actually doesn't help your bone structure very much. And so during that 7-year period, you are releasing toxins that you have sequestered in your bones for years. And this is why we see so many people during that period. So it's not only the drop off of hormones, but also the releasing of toxins. So I'm always concerned when someone is having cognitive decline during that period, it suggests that they may have toxin exposure that has been undiagnosed. And so we recommend to people, please get evaluated, and especially if they have a non-amnestic presentation. In other words, about 2/3 of people who are headed for Alzheimer's will have an amnestic presentation. Their big problem is learning new things, as you know. But about 1/3 of them will have a non-amnestic presentation. That means it's not so much about the memory. It's about planning. It's about what's called executive function, figuring things out. They'll have trouble working their iPhone. They'll have trouble working something new. They'll have trouble planning things at a job. They'll have trouble doing calculations sometimes trouble navigating. All of these are non-amnestic presentations, and they are typically associated with either toxin exposure or pathogens. Sometimes people have been bitten by ticks, for example, and get Lyme disease, or other tick-borne illnesses. So we have a number of people where they get treated for the Lyme years ago, everything's good. But they don't realize the tick also included other pathogens, Ehrlichia, Bartonella, Babesia, Anaplasma, these sorts of things. And by the way, one of the people who wrote the story talked about hers. She got Ehrlichia. She lives in New York as well. And she also got Babesia. And so she's now, or sorry, Bartonella in her case. And she's treating him and she's doing great. And she's back out on the golf course, hitting golf balls. She said she has no problem with remembering scores, not only her own, but the people she's playing with, et cetera. So, all of these things are critical. And this is why it's so important for people to get evaluated, to make it so that very few people ever develop Alzheimer's disease.
This is super interesting. I've never heard that we have toxins stored in our bones, and then it can release into the system, and it's circulating in our bodies once we hit this menopause age and we start to lose our hormones and the bones. I mean, it sounds like you're heading towards osteopenia, osteoporosis, that direction, right? Many
Yes.
women do. We just have that, so it's not unusual. And this is releasing toxins into the body, and I find that fascinating, and something that I'm sure many doctors didn't even think about when you're talking about Alzheimer's.
And bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, which I recognize is controversial, but as far as brain health, it is very helpful. Not only does it decrease that bone resorption, it also increases detoxification. So when your body is exposed to toxins, so when I say toxins, there's 3 groups of toxins that we're all exposed to. And unfortunately, as everyone knows, we live in a toxic world. So we are exposed to inorganic toxins, things like air pollution, things like mercury that's in fillings, for example. Then we're also exposed to organic toxins. And these are things like the formaldehyde, glyphosate, toluene, benzene, things like that. And of course, in Europe, things are much better with glyphosate than they are in the US, but they're present in both places, but at a worse level in the US. And then, of course, they're in things like cosmetics. So you got to be really careful about that. And of course, the Environmental Working Group has done a great job with showing, here are the ones that are less toxic. Good idea to stick with those. And then the third group of toxins are actually biotoxins. These are toxins that are made by organisms that we get exposed to. And the most common one is mold. And so to be fair, there are lots of mold species that don't typically produce bad mycotoxins, but there are 5 bad guys. And then unfortunately, they're in a lot of our houses, and it's easy to check. There's something called an ERMI score that was actually set up by the Environmental Protection Agency, so they can tell you how bad is the mold in your house. So the 5 bad ones are Stachybotrys, that's the bad black mold that we all hear about, the toxic black mold, Aspergillus, Penicillium, Chaetomium, and Wallemia. Those are the big 5 bad guys. And they make, unfortunately, toxins that damage your nervous system. They damage your kidneys. They damage your immune system. They can even be associated with developing cancers. So good idea to detox and just have a less toxic lifestyle. And of course, I wrote about this in the First Survivors of Alzheimer's to help people to get detox. So when your body gets exposed to these things, it does everything possible to get rid of them. So it metabolizes them, it cuts them up, it sends them out through your skin. So sweating helps get rid of them, sends them out through your breath, sends them out, your sneezing, sends them out through urination, through elimination of all forms. So all of these things are working together to minimize. And of course, one of the things that it does is sequester them in your bones, in your brain, in your other organs. So this is where you can get damage to kidneys, liver, brain, et cetera, during your lifetime. So this is why detox is so helpful and living a relatively lower toxic lifestyle.
You're absolutely right. And so I'm wondering if there's a differentiation when you say that the toxins are held inside the bones. We know that the fat cells like to hold on to toxins, and that's the way of protecting us from circulation. So is it different than that? Is it in the sense that they're inside the bone, the cells of the bones. And then it's being released once you release the bones. So it's
Right.
kind of the same principle in the sense that you need to detox, because especially people who are trying to lose weight, right? Or do a detox and then they don't do it correctly. They're releasing these toxins into the bloodstream and they're not sweating or peeing or pooing and, all that stuff. And it's just kind of sitting there. So there's a way to detox as well, right?
It's a great point. Now, as you can imagine, the fat-soluble ones are more going to be in the fat cells. That makes sense. And the less fat-soluble ones, the water-soluble ones, are going to be more in the bones. So yeah, there are differences depending on which organ. And you're right, people can actually detox too quickly. And we do see that, where sometimes doctors will be very aggressive with the detox. And you can unfortunately, increase your blood levels while you're trying to detox. So if that happens, back off a little bit. Take it more slowly.
You mentioned, and in the book too, you give such great resources, and the patients themselves give resources on what they've done and who they've seen and what products they've used and brands and all the details that we want when we're kind of going through something similar. But I want to go back to talking about the hormone therapies being neuroprotective, because as doctors, there are plenty of doctors who say it's neuroprotective, but I understand that if you talk to somebody who's in like a menopause society president or something, they say the jury is still out and that it's still inconclusive, and talk about the research or the studies that are being done. And so when will we have conclusions, and should a woman going through menopause wait until there are definite conclusions before optimizing her hormones with hormone therapy for her brain?
Yeah, this is such a good point. I think that it's important to talk to someone who really does this for a living, someone who's really an expert in this area. And my source, as I mentioned in the book, is Dr. Anne Hathaway. She has spent her career looking at BHRT and prescribing BHRT to appropriate people. And her point is that if you look at the studies, she often quotes one out of Stanford that was particularly revealing, showing improvement in cognition with BHRT. And I think you're going to see more and more of these. The thing, of course, that got everybody off it was the WHI study that came out about, 17 years ago, something like that. And everybody just suddenly stopped. The problem with that study, in the positive, I should say, is it's huge. It's a huge study. But the problem with it was it looked at people who were on synthetic progesterones and synthetic estrogens. And there's no question, they do not work as well. Whereas the ones that have looked at BHRT since then have found better results. Now, there are all sorts of other issues. Do you have a history of breast cancer? Do you have a history of hormone-responsive uterine cancer, for example? How old are you? Now, to be fair, Dr. Hathaway has used this approach in people who were in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Wow.
But some people will argue, no, you need to only confine it to people in their 40s and early 50s. So there are differences of opinion. And the answer to your question, when will everyone agree? Never. Because it's not that black and white. So there will always be experts who are saying, well, if you do it this way, and it's going to depend on your genetics, it's going to depend on your history, it's going to depend on your levels, just so many different things that can impact this. So I always come back to, if you have no cognitive decline and you are simply there for prevention, you could consider avoiding BHRT for the time being. But if you actually do develop cognitive decline, it's such a critical thing that you probably don't want to leave that one out. You probably do want to optimize your hormonal status, because it's one of the most powerful things for your cognition. And that's seen again and again in studies.
Yes, it's such a personal decision. So I highly encourage people to just learn, study, educate yourself. Don't be afraid. Don't just do anything either. I think we're all bio-individual and we all have to understand the risks, the benefits. We're in a biohacking space. This is our people who are hack my age. We're trying to hack our age, and we're all about prevention. So we tend to have people who listen to the podcast who are wanting to optimize their health, even though they're doing pretty well, but we want to prevent. So that's when I would say, look, encourage you, even if you don't feel any symptoms, I mean, get your blood work done, do the cognitive tests, just figure yourself out, understand your body, know how it works. And we're all about taking control of our own body. Just, you are the doctor of your own body. Your doctor is just trying to help you figure things out and navigate the way. So that's sort of my take on HRT. And just read about it, educate yourself about it, and then make your own decision if this is for you or for not in consultation with your doctors.
And for hacking, I mean, this, as you say, this is an era where hacking your age and hacking your own medicine and biology and health is so huge. And your brain health, your gut health, all of these things. And there's so much now that's available that wasn't even available 5 or 10 years ago. Forget, way back when I learned medicine way back in the 1970s. This is stuff that's really available. And so, all the wearables, and I don't know how much you've talked about those, but I mean, you can now find out about your own gut microbiome, your telomere length, your continuous glucose monitoring, your heart rate variability, your oxygenation, the stages of sleep, and just on and on and on. So you can really kind of figure out, here's where I stand, and here are the things that would be really helpful to me to get optimal brain health, optimal gut health, and so forth and so on. And of course, it makes a huge difference. And it will make a difference in your future. And again, we believe that at this point, for people to do the right thing, you can truly reduce the global burden of dementia, and everyone can have a really positive impact on their likelihood of cognitive decline.
And to add to that, the protocol that you give, and you have great detail in how that all works, not only in the books that you write, but on the website, it will reduce, as I understand, it seems to me, the risk of so many other diseases, because you are going to improve your cardiovascular disease just by following some of these things. So it's good for the brain, it's probably good for the heart, and so many other issues. So I think there's a lot of benefit, not just for brain health, by following protocol, being preventive with your just taking prevention as well. So I want to just discuss a little bit about sleep, because you mentioned sleep as well. We, all the gadgets that we use and that to try to monitor it. But when I was studying for my master's of gerontology at USC with your colleague, Dr. Christian Pike, who's lectured us on neurodegenerative diseases, I had to write a paper, and I decided to look at the associations and risks of women going through menopause, sleep disturbances, and dementia. And I really wanted to cover this because we know up to 63% of the women going through menopause have issues with sleep. So it's insomnia or trouble falling asleep, and restless leg syndrome, all this hormone fluctuations are stopping us from getting a good night's sleep. So it's bad enough that we feel tired when we wake up, or we're having throughout the day. But when we understand the glymphatic system, and this is our brain detox mode that happens mostly when we're sleeping, I worry that women may be missing out on a really important part of sleep that may put them at higher risk for dementia. So how concerned should a woman going through this menopause transition be about sleep and sleep disturbances and her risks of developing Alzheimer's?
Well, no question. Sleep is critical to get optimal sleep to prevent cognitive decline. So you're right. We should be concerned. And, you could spend hours just talking about sleep. And of course, there's a wonderful book by Professor Matthew Walker, who's actually just right here across the bay from me over at Berkeley. And Matthew has written a wonderful book that's called Why We Sleep. And of course, Arianna Huffington has also written a very nice book on sleep. Both of those, I highly recommend them. So, there are a whole host of things. Number one is that you want to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep if you can. And I know that's hard for most people. I mean, as someone who was an intern getting virtually no sleep, and I know it's hard sometimes to get the requisite amount of sleep, but you've got your Oura Ring on, I see, so you can follow your own sleep. Then you want to make sure you have at least an hour of deep sleep and at least an hour and a half of REM sleep. So again, very, very helpful. And then you want to make sure that you're not waking up frequently at night. Sorry, you were going to say something, Zora?
You got cut off. How much deep sleep and an hour and a half of REM sleep?
At least an hour of deep sleep and at least an hour and a half of REM sleep. And you may have a little more. That's just great. But you don't want to be walking around with 5 or 10 minutes of deep sleep and 15 minutes of REM sleep. There's something wrong there. And then you have to figure out, and it may be that you're depressed about something. It may be that you're anxious about something, as you mentioned. It may be, again, hormones. And of course, progesterone is critical for optimal sleep. And people who are very low, and we hear this all the time with, as you know, estrogen dominance, which is a problem, especially in perimenopause, where the progesterone can tend to drop first, and now you become relatively estrogen dominant, and you often have poor sleep. And you often can wake up, and so then, of course, melatonin is falling as we get a little older, as we get into our 40s. And then so you may be a little bit low on your melatonin. So again, the good news is there are all sorts of things that you can do. And of course, for many of us, and I'm doing the worst possible thing tonight, being up late and then going straight from talking to bed. That's not a good thing to ramp down. You don't want to have your Wi-Fi on. You don't want to have blue light. You don't want to have all these things going on when you're getting ready for common for people to wake up in the middle of the night. And one of the common things is ruminating. And you hear this all the time. And in fact, in that particular case, L-tryptophan, very good. 300 to 500 milligrams of L-tryptophan, very, very good. Get this over the counter. Very good for people who are ruminating, who have that, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., where they wake up and they just start thinking about everything in their lives. So that's another thing. So the good news is all of these things are addressable. And of course, a lot of people point out, hey, we're exposed to way too much in terms of EMFs. So yeah, turn it off at night. Don't be having your phone close to you and things like that, because it's just going to contribute to poor sleep. And shut it down. You mentioned the glymphatic system. What is it that shuts down your glymphatic system? It's adrenaline. It's that anything that's going to shut down your glymphatics. So you got to let your glymphatics do their job, move that stuff out, cleanse your brain every night. That's also why it's good to have a fasting period. And you don't want to eat right up until bedtime. Stop at least 3 hours before, so that now in the middle of the night, you're activating that autophagy. And again, you're cleaning things. It's amazing how putting this whole system together actually gives so many people better cognition and prevention of cognitive decline.
I love all of these protocols, and you go into such great detail and in the book too. It's such a biohacker's dream. This is what we all do, and we all try to practice as much as we can. You mentioned autophagy. Now,
Yes.
In the biohacking space, we're all about autophagy, and this is that cellular cleanup and recycling process. We all want to get in there and activate it through exercise and fasting and certain foods and supplements. Now, how big of a role in terms of our brain health does autophagy play? Is it really big, or is it just a small bit on top of everything else that we need to do?
That's a great question. And the answer is different for each person. So for some people, it is big. And here's why. In fact, interestingly, there are some neuroscientists who are trying to develop treatments for neurodegenerative disease that just consist of enhancing autophagy. And that's because they believe that these diseases are caused by misfolding of proteins. So you now get, and you see in all these diseases, Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body disease, all of these have one thing in common, which is that they do have aggregates of proteins in the cells. And you see it with beta amyloid, and they have it outside the cells as well. And you see it with phospho-tau in Alzheimer's disease. And you see it with something called TDP-43 in ALS and also in frontotemporal dementia. And of course, you see it with Lewy bodies in Lewy body dementia and in Parkinson's disease and in something called MSA, multiple system atrophy. So all these different things have different aggregated proteins, but you can help yourself by helping to cleanse these. And so in those cases, autophagy is helpful. Now, the problem that we see is that this disease is not limited. It's not that one little thing, just you misfolded a protein. To be fair, for people who have familial diseases where you're getting you're getting it in every single generation, it often will be from a mutation that enhances the misfolding. And in that case, autophagy, very important. For many of us, though, what's happening is we're getting this as a sporadic disease. It's not hitting many, many people in the family. It may hit our mother or father and maybe one of us, but it's not like incredibly common. And so in those cases, there are insults that are actually causing the problem. And that's what had been not appreciated enough. There are various infections, change in your oral microbiome. And I recommend to everyone, please get an oral DNA test, find out about your oral microbiome. There are specific pathogens that give you this increased risk for periodontitis, and they also give you an increased risk for cognitive decline. You're now creating an inflammatory state, which is not good for you. Of course, that inflammatory state also increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. So there are so many of these things, and it's going to be different. So autophagy, very important for some people, much less important for others.
What a great answer. Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the oral microbiome, because my next guest is I guess a biohacking dentist, let's say, and he talks, we're going to talk a lot about our oral microbiome and how that can be a missing link for a lot of people. They're not looking at their mouth and the things that they're doing that may be contributing to their poor health. So thank you for bringing that up. I would love to open up. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, and I would love to open the mic to anyone here who has questions. Please, you can either type them in the comments or unmute. We always, Magdalena's got always great questions. Let's start with you. And then if anyone else, just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello.
Hello, Magdalena.
Again. I'm sorry I couldn't connect at the beginning for 10-15 minutes. I hope I didn't miss something very important. Anyway, I will listen once again later. I wanted to ask, I found out via a genetic predisposition test that I have hemochromatosis type 1 gene, and I have a problem with overload of iron in the body. And whenever I am going to the laboratory, always too high iron levels, and I really try to avoid everything what I suppose to be a lot of iron in it, supplements, also the food and so on. And now I think that this could be also related to dementia, right? So I would like to ask you if you have any tips what to do in my case. Thank you so much.
Sure. So first of all, as you already know, one of the common things to do for people with hemochromatosis, which is a relatively common problem, is to get blood drawn. So you actually remove the blood along with removing some of the iron. And it's a good way to go, and people do very well for many years. The second point to know is that the association of hemochromatosis with dementia, although yes, there is a small, there is not a huge, so people who have hemochromatosis are not at greatly increased risk for cognitive decline. It's a very modest change. So there are a lot of other things that would be much more worrisome as far as your cognition. So you should do very well. Third thing is, I would again get a cognoscopy and get on the appropriate protocol to minimize your risk for cognitive decline. And then fourth, there are all sorts of approaches, given the iron can give you oxidative damage to your cells. So there are things like glutathione that could be very helpful, and there are iron chelators. So again, work with an expert in hemochromatosis to minimize its impact, and you should actually do very, very well for many years.
Thank you. Maybe one additional question. I started to take a supplement, HCl with pepsin because, I will be 58 and most probably my body is not metabolizing proteins well. So I started to take this supplement. Do you think that this might be a problem if I have a problem with iron loading? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, I would talk to your physician about that, but it shouldn't be a problem. But I think the question is, why did you start taking it? Did you find out that your stomach acid is low? And so of course, for many of us, it is low. But did you find out that yours is actually low?
Yes.
You did. You found out. Okay. So if your stomach acid is low, then it's fine to take some. Often people will take betaine, HCl, that sort of thing. And do you take it with your meals? When do you take it? You want to be careful. You don't want to take it when there's no
Always with my meals.
Yeah,
Always.
that's good because that can certainly hurt your stomach lining. So you want to be careful because yes, if you take it at the wrong time or if you take too much of it, it can damage the lining of your stomach. So you want to just be careful about making sure that there's that you have something in your stomach when you're taking it, and don't overdo it. I usually recommend to people that if you're going to take these enzymes, do it when there are things that you really need your proteases for. You're taking something which cleaves proteins. So, if you're eating a highly proteinaceous meal, for example, you may find that you don't need it when you're eating, for example, a salad, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Sure. I hope everything goes very well. It should.
So,
all right, Zora, how are we doing?
Yeah, I'm gonna let you go, but I have one question because you mentioned in the book, and I found it very curious because I have an interview coming up with the founder of the Katsu bands, and
yeah,
Stephen something months something like that. Oh, anyways, we're going to talk about the Katsu bands,
good.
How that can be very helpful for people who are aging, and you mentioned this in the protocol, and I was really surprised that was, and there was one of the survivors who talked about how she uses her Katsu bands, and this is Katsu bands are blood flow restriction paste. People don't understand what that is. Originated in Japan to help people maintain muscle or increase human growth hormone or help patients recover from a variety of illnesses or issues. So how is Katsu helping the brain?
Yeah, it's a good point. And you probably know, some of the Olympic athletes used Katsu bands. So they're out there. A lot of people are using them. Again, it's kind of part of the biohacking. We have so many people where they don't get very good blood flow to the brain. And so when you're restricting a little, you're doing a couple things. Number one, you're getting more bang for your buck. You can't do as many, for example, as many curls. You can't do as much. And so you're building muscle more quickly because your muscle is recognizing, oh, wait a minute, I'm not quite getting enough here. I better secrete some trophic support here. There is a signal that comes from your muscle that actually works on your whole system, including your brain. So you improve your blood flow. And of course, having more muscle makes you more insulin sensitive. There are insulin receptors on muscle cells. One of the most common contributors to cognitive decline is insulin resistance. And there are about 80 million Americans, about a quarter of the population, that has significant insulin resistance. So we check this on everybody to see where, you want to know, again, if you're biohacking, you want to know your HOMA-IR. Is your HOMA-IR 1.0, or are you up at 2.0, which is significant insulin resistance? Or are you up at 3.0, which is pretty bad insulin resistance? Part of the protocol is to restore insulin sensitivity. So interestingly, our brains require one of two things, and we should be able to go back and forth between burning glucose and burning ketones. What happens, though, as we get into our 30s, 40s, 50s, we lose both of those. You lose the ability to metabolize glucose because of insulin resistance, because of high carbohydrate diets. Now, the problem is, because of that, your insulin is going up. It's high, which is part of the insulin resistance. So you're now churning out the insulin. The high insulin prevents your system from making ketones. So now you've lost both. So when I see people who have cognitive decline, I consider it an emergency. they are low on their energetics for their brain. We want to restore the insulin sensitivity and restore the ability to burn and make ketones. And so the Katsu bands help both on the side of the blood flow and on the side of the insulin sensitivity.
Interesting. Yeah, it was really confused. Well, you're restricting blood flow, so how is that getting to the brain? So I appreciate that explanation. We'll be talking about you for sure in our interview. Thank you so
much. The other big one to remember is EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy. And again, so many of us will have incomplete support for our brain because of the blood flow and because of the oxygenation. And so again, there's another one that can be very helpful. There are so many things, again, that everyone can do to get optimal cognition and to keep optimal cognition.
Thank you. It's so detailed in the book, and I really encourage everyone to get all of the books. I've read them all. I think they're fabulous. They're such great guidance, and you'll see how people are actually putting this into place, and you'll get inspired. And there's so many more things. I would love to have you on again to talk a little bit more detail about the specifics on how to get into the protocol and things like that. So I so appreciate you staying up late for us. I want to let you go to bed. I'm excited about the documentary. Please, I'm sure it will be. I will find out through the biohacking circles.
I don't have a release date. As soon as I know when it's coming out, I'll let you know.
Please let us know, and we will shout it from the rooftops for you as well. And the study as well. I'm excited to see how the new study goes. So keep us posted with that. If anyone wants to find out more information, you are all over the place. You are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm going to have links to find you always at Dr. Dr. Dale Bredesen, as well as apollohealthco.com. That's where I think it's a fabulous resource where people can find support groups and health coaching and just more details. All your books are there too. There's the practitioner. I think if anyone's listening and they want to become a practitioner, there's so much support there. Is there anywhere else that I've missed, anywhere we can else to find you?
There's some stuff on YouTube as well, but yeah, I think you've hit the highlights. And thank you so much, Zora, for having me on. Thanks everyone for the questions, and I hope that everyone will successfully biohack and prevent cognitive decline. Look, this should be a rare problem, cognitive decline, and if we all do the right things, it will be a rare problem.
Oh, thank you for giving us hope. Thank you for all the research that you do. And we hope to have you on again very soon.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Zora.